IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to Takshashila's All Things Policy podcast. My name is Sachin Kalbag. I am Senior Fellow at the Takshashila Institution. The year 2022 saw two new concepts proposed by Xi Jinping: the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative, both called GSI and GDI. Initially, they were kept vague and broad to include later elements that would suit the Chinese Communist Party. Over the months, some dimensions emerged that reveal the Chinese leadership's overall goals. One dimension is clear from the statements of the Chinese leaders, including Xi and at that time Wang Yi, the emphasis on BRICS and its addition to the China-Africa Vision 2035, that they are aimed at shaping the vision of the international order. At the BAO Global Security Forum conference last year in April, Xi introduced the GDI, stressing that China had global ambitions to lead the countries in their interests, quote unquote. The Chinese leadership recently reiterated its proposal to build a community of what our head of the Indo-Pacific program, Manoj Kewalramani, says, common destiny for mankind, which presents an alternative vision for the world order. And to quote Manoj again, in order to achieve this objective, Beijing is seeking to bring about fundamental institutional and normative changes to global governance. It is within this context that Chinese President Xi Jinping launched the GDI, the GSI, and the Global Civilization Initiative, the GCI. Analyzing the speeches by Chinese leaders, policy publications, media and analytical discourse in China, along with actual policy decisions, Manoj, who's the head of Takshashila's Indo-Pacific program, authored recently an assessment that provides a SWOT analysis of current geopolitical churn from Beijing's perspective. His document then places the launch of the GDI, GSI, and GCI within that context before detailing the elements of each initiative and distilling their shared, stated, and implicit agenda. The assessment then concludes that the launch of these initiatives presages a far more proactive foreign policy approach by Beijing. Through GDI, GSI, and GSI, the Chinese leadership hopes to shape an external environment that not only ensures regime security, but is also favorable for China's development and security interests. In doing so, however, it is reshaping key norms of global governance towards a fundamentally illiberal direction. Today, I will be discussing with Manoj what these three initiatives are and what they mean to India and to the rest of the world. Manoj, thank you so much for joining. Welcome to All Things Policy.
Hey, Sachin, thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be discussing this.
Manoj, 45 minutes is too short a time to discuss Xi's global ambitions. But just to discuss what you wrote in the discussion document, GDI, GSI, and GSI, could you please elaborate on each of them? Perhaps give us some background, the context, and the thinking behind them.
Sure. I think each of these, I like to refer to them as the alphabet soup of Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy, because it's truly something remarkable in terms of the thought process that has gone into framing these three distinct initiatives. And if you want to understand sort of why these specific initiatives and why these names, I think if you roll back a little bit, to try and understand how Xi Jinping views the world. If you look at what Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping himself, and Chinese media commentary discusses when they talk about the world and how it's changing, there are sort of three broad strands that come out, right? One is that the balance of power internationally is shifting. It is moving in favor of China, but it's not necessarily decisively shifted in the favor of China or the East, right? So there is a trend where the West is losing its relative power, typified by obviously America's internal challenges and America's decline of relative power. And an example of that is, say, the US withdrawal in Afghanistan. And obviously Europe's reducing stake as a global economic powerhouse. And compare that to sort of China's rising stake and the Indo-Pacific becoming a strategic construct, because obviously countries in Asia are far more prominent. So there is a shift of balance of power happening, which creates opportunities and challenges. Xi Jinping also talks about the fact that amidst this churn that's taking place, which he says is a once in a century churn, he says that there are four deficits that are plaguing the world today, right? There's a deficit of development, there's a deficit of peace, there's a deficit of governance, and there's a deficit of trust. Now, if you keep all these four in mind, you will see that GDI, GSI, and GCI each correlate to these deficits. So he says that Chinese foreign policy must respond to these deficits, not because there is some altruistic reason to shape a better world, but because it is in China's interest to do so. And today, after 40 plus years of tremendous growth, China has the capacity to be much more active and to do much more. So why is that necessary? Because look, China's future growth is critically dependent on the external environment, whether it be in terms of stability in its neighborhood, whether it be in terms of access to markets internationally, whether it be in terms of access to raw materials, whether it be in terms of access to food and commodities and so on, so things. So therefore, China must be engaged much more actively internationally. So it is in this context that these three initiatives were launched. The GDI very quickly was launched in September 2021 at the UN General Assembly in a speech given by Xi Jinping. The core idea there was that he wants to put development at the center of global diplomacy. And again, this comes at a time where the pandemic is still raging, deep frictions between the United States and China, and this threat of a new Cold War. And he's saying, hey, look, Cold War, Old War is all different. Right now, we need to focus on development. The GSI came in April last year, like you said. The idea of the GSI was that, look, we don't want Cold Wars. There has to be a new framework to think about international security. And China is proposing a framework. And the third is the Global Civilization Initiative, which deals with the deficit of trust between societies. It deals with, normatively, the argument that the Chinese are making is that, hey, look, this idea of clash of civilizations is unhealthy. It's not something that is good for anybody. And it is not the trend of the way the world should develop, given how economically interconnected we are and how much we understand that there are transnational challenges like climate change, migration, and so on and so forth. So we need to build trust between civilizations. And therefore, he's purportedly launching this Global Civilization Initiative to build that trust. So that's how they have pitched these three initiatives.
But in terms of the overall context for global governance, because this is something also that you touch upon in your document, is this Xi's way of saying that China's time is not just now but also for perpetuity? Just to give just to understand from the background of America, for instance, America after the 1945, the end of the Second World War, became a dominant nation because of its economic progress and because it developed so fast industrially. But at the same time, China, when it started its economic liberalization program, mainly in the 1970s, what Deng Xiaoping did and what his successors did, has propelled China to global dominance. Was that not enough for China? Does it have to do this in terms of influencing other countries, making it part of their centerpiece of their foreign policy? Where is if you can just put all of these things in context with Xi as the person and Xi as the leader, perhaps that will give us a greater idea or better idea of what exactly is going on.
Yeah, sure. Look, there is a reason why America became the power that it became, right? And part of it had to do with the capacity that it had, right? The power that it had. And you can look at different dimensions of power, right? Economic power, military capacity, the resilience of the American system vis-a-vis the resilience of the Soviet system, which eventually was fragile and collapsed. America's diplomatic capacity, America's institutional presence in terms of its ability to build different institutions like NATO, and the resilience of those institutions, America's presence at places like the UN Security Council, and of course, America's soft power and discourse capacity, right? All of those are sort of different tools within your basket of power. And America had a lot of that and still continues to have a lot of that. So post World War II, America had significantly higher power than any other entity in the world. Perhaps the Soviet Union ranked second, but it was not necessarily a close second. The other aspect of what great powers do, and why, if you want to understand what China is doing today with these three initiatives, is to try and cultivate legitimacy.
Hmm.
How do you cultivate legitimacy? Legitimacy comes when uh, different actors sort of agree upon certain things, certain propositions, certain norms, certain rules, certain institutions, and you have the power to be able to sustain those norms and institutions, right? So America's power allowed it to underwrite certain institutional structures. NATO, for one, certain norms like, say, democracy and liberal democracy being fundamentally good and an effective system of governance. It allowed America to sort of, in some ways, export its domestic ideas, export certain domestic values, whether it be regarding individual rights, whether it be regarding freedom of individuals as opposed to, say, freedom of a community to do what it wants to do, being primary. And those ideas then get embedded in legislation, in international rules, in international behavior, and countries start to believe that is the good thing to do. Um,
Hmm.
so great powers essentially seek both, right? They seek to cultivate these sources of power and to cultivate this legitimacy. And where these two intersect, where they have sufficient power and sufficient legitimacy, where their propositions become, the most obvious thing in the world, that's when they cultivate genuine authority. So that's when you want to get something done, when you want to nudge or push or get a country to behave in a certain way, the authority that you've cultivated is so sufficient and makes it so obvious that the country doesn't challenge the propositions that you're putting forward. And democracy and liberal democracy is a classic example of this, right? The idea that we believe that liberal democracy is among the best forms of governance systems that we have. The idea that we reflexively believe that is a success of American authority since the Second World War. It's a success of that argument. Now, whether that argument is good or bad is secondary. I tend to believe that it's a good argument, and therefore I'm supportive of it. But I think that it's a success of that argument. And today, what you're seeing China do is that it's fundamentally contesting that. It's contesting that because it feels that the success of that normative argument internationally undermines the Chinese system of governance because it is not liberal democracy. And
Yes.
therefore, China today feels that it has sufficient power to be able to push back against that norm and say, hey, look, there are different types of democracies. And ours is a different type of democracy, and not just different, ours is a much more effective democracy. And it can make that argument today because it has demonstrated some success, but also its power to make that argument has enhanced. Right, it's China's overall power in terms of economic, military, diplomatic capacity, soft power, and discourse capacity has expanded. So it is now seeking to cultivate this authority. And if you cultivate this authority, it means that external challenges to your regime immediately diminish, not just in the physical sense, in terms of military and economic challenges, but also in the ideational sense. There are no competing ideas. And I think that's what Xi Jinping is trying to do, because if you go back to Xi Jinping when he came to power in 2012 and 2013, when he became president, in one of the early sort of meetings he had, he was quite clear that the ideological sphere, the media sphere, is a battleground. And that's the approach towards the domain of ideas. And why is that approach? Because he feared that so-called universal values, which he believes are Western values, universal values like, say, the universality of human rights, that all societies, in terms of their care for human rights, lead to a certain end which is much more individual focused, much more focused towards freedom of the individual and things like that, and reduced intervention of the state. To him, that is not what the Chinese experience is, and that is not what the Chinese system is. So that value is a fundamental threat to the party's monopoly on power, and therefore you need to push back at it. At home, you can use coercion, but that's a very ugly way of doing things, right? Coercing your people. It's much
Exactly.
better for authoritarians if people themselves believe that the system is good and it is desirable. So I think this is an effort in terms of that ideational domain contestation that Xi Jinping is engaging in.
But I want to pick on two or three words that you used, and I think they're relevant and very contextual. One is the American dominance is primarily because it is a liberal democracy, and it is welcoming to immigrants, for instance. It is welcoming to ideas from the rest of the world. And it allowed people to come there and thrive. The Chinese system does not really allow that. Also, because it is not a liberal democracy, the trust gap that China has with the rest of the world may be bridged primarily because of the economic dependence on China of several countries, but it may not necessarily have the trust factor which other countries have with the United States. So, for example, Nepal recently refused to join the GSI with China. And at the same time, it was India. It kind of sided with India when China released its map, and that kind of gave us an impression that yes, even a relatively smaller nation like Nepal can stand up to China when it comes to these kind of initiatives. Could you place that in the larger context of what she wants to achieve, and the fact that its economic quote unquote bullying of other countries is primarily the reason that other countries are saying okay to what China says, but otherwise they are not really trustworthy of what China says, trusting of what China says?
Yeah, I mean, I think I will sort of differentiate between so the American appeal and the appeal of the American model is predominantly, like you said, right? The idea of the American dream is that wherever you are from, whoever you are, you can make a home over there and you can prosper over there, right? That's the ideal of the American dream, right? And you can, whoever you are, wherever you are, you can come there, you can make a life and you can make a success of yourself and you can become whoever you have the potential to become. It's not necessarily a state centric idea. So therefore, citizens and individuals might feel attracted to go to the United States. And of course, now there are challenges of that in terms of populism in America and social fissures and all of that. So the American appeal is more to the individual and to the immigrant, like you said. The Chinese argument is being made to governments and to states and to authorities in power, right? So the Chinese argument of the civilizational trust is not so much about give me your tired, hungry, poor, and whatever, and the Chinese argument is more in the context of look. Firstly, sovereignty is primary. Each state, and therefore the state is the individual actor that you're considering, right? So if you want to maintain your sovereignty, the American model or the American argument, which says that some things are universal, is undermining sovereignty. What we are saying is sovereignty is primary, so we will not interfere in your internal affairs, and we have no desire to. And therefore, however you determine human rights or citizens' development should, or so social organization should be within your society and your territory, is your business. It makes no difference to us.
Right.
So the appeal is therefore to authorities and state. In that sense, given the world that we are today in, where there has been such a trust deficit with the U.S. government, particularly over the last 20 plus years, with the war on terrorism, American invasions, and so on and so forth. The Chinese have found sort of fertile ground in trying to reach out to different countries, firstly, to say that, hey, look, we are a rising power, but we're not going to be following that model. Our model is that the state and sovereignty is supreme. So we are okay with your authority and whatever you do internally, provided we can deal with each other at an interest based level. So in that sense, there is an appeal for that model, right? The second thing, in terms of, say, China being the ground to attract talent and to attract people, I think that's a legitimate issue, right? It does not offer that, it does not, there is that appeal does not exist. And therefore, what you see in terms of, say, GDI or even GSI or GCI also, GDI has programs with regard to capacity building. So those must be around poverty alleviation, education, food security, agriculture, and things like that. So what China is saying that, look, we've made successes in some of these domains. We will help you guys in terms of achieving what we have achieved by trying to improve your agriculture, mechanize it, get it better, by exporting best practices when it comes to education, by supporting building schools, by trying to sort of support you in these helping you provide vaccines, building hospitals, doing doctor training and things like that. So we'll try and do the citizens bit there. In terms of security, what they're saying is that, hey, look, we can train you in how we'd manage security, because there is no country in the world, not even the United States, which has managed social stability like we have. We don't have the kind of violence that the United States has or the rest of the world has. And that is a key factor for us growing. So if you're a developing country which wants to grow, learn security management from us. So let's do law enforcement cooperation. Let's do military cooperation. We'll help provide you equipment. We help do those things. Again, it's a state-centric view, but that's one view, right? You're training's official organs. Under GCI, you're saying, okay, we need to build organic connections, which is where you said China is weak, and it is weak. The objective is, let's do youth gatherings. Let's do, hearing. Let's do sort of archaeological preservation. Let's do, scholarly exchanges. So let's do these kinds of things where we can build some degree of trust amongst our people, and that's a part of GCI. But the objective is essentially, each of these initiatives is essentially targeted at states, because the Chinese approach is towards ruling authorities in any country, as opposed to necessarily organic linkages. And their argument is that America's organic linkages approach is fundamentally undermining of sovereignty in that sense. And the end product is that it undermines regime stability in other countries, and it undermines sovereignty, and it tries to implement regime change either overtly by use of force or covertly by trying to cultivate certain seditious ideas within your society, which is, again, authoritarian leaders would love that. And that's what China is playing to.
On that note, Manoj will take a quick break. We will join after these few promos.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Thank you for joining us. We have Manoj Kewalramani with us today discussing GDI, GSI, and GCI. Manoj, just before the break, you spoke about what are the various challenges that China faces. I want to talk a little bit about GCI, because to me it looks very, very interesting in terms of the underpinnings that the normative underpinnings that you've mentioned in the document. And I thought that many of them are very common to what even India's thinking in terms of domestic and foreign policy is. For example, modernization is not westernization, upholding the principle of independence to explore diversified paths towards modernization, knows one size fits all model of promoting and protecting human rights, state centric perspective as opposed to individual centric view to regard to the values that inform governance, equality of states, inviolability of state sovereignty. And you mentioned this briefly just before the break, but when you look at countries, nations, rising and want to, have kind of influence on the global governance order, at least on these issues, India and China, although India has not said it officially, but India and China seem to be thinking along the same lines. Do you agree with that assessment?
I think that there are certain commonalities, yes, for sure. And I think this is sort of, but natural, because I mean, at the end of the day, you're looking at a different set of actors from what we had in the past, who are rising and becoming. When I say in the past, obviously I mean post World War II, who are rising and becoming prominent, and therefore they will bring their own vision to normative issues in terms of global governance. Where I think, at a surface level, I think that not just India, but I think some of the folks in the West will also agree with the idea that modernization is not Westernization. And yes, countries can do their own things a little bit, but the best things are what the West has achieved. I think that why, and these are not new arguments, right? I mean, this idea of modernization is not Westernization. I've learned from colleagues in Takshashila that there was a scholar in Karnataka who said this in the 1950s. So it's not a new idea, right? Where it has import today, and what China is doing with this is that it's using these ideas firstly to try and equate what are liberal values with Westernization. And it is then trying to undermine liberal value, which I think is detrimental from an Indian interest perspective also. So while I agree, modernization is not Westernization, India's path to modernization must be different, just like China's path has been different, and it will be distinct. Yet, certain liberal values, I think, are signs of modernity, are signs of a civilization which is evolving. Um, and what I mean by liberal values are, of course, values which prioritize individual rights, individual freedoms, rule of law, so on and so forth. Where essentially there is due process, there is freedom for individuals much more prioritized than necessarily communities, than necessarily the state, and so on and so forth. But the individual is much more empowered than the state. What China is doing, that it is equating that with Westernization. It is equating global responses to certain issues and saying that, look, those responses must happen within a state-centric model. So it is re-emphasizing the fact that the state is the central actor, the nation state is a central actor in international affairs, and thereby undermining what transnational institutional work has been built, over the past 6, 7, 8 decades. And I think that is a challenge. A bigger challenge also, along with that, is the fact this is emphasis on civilizational or cultural inheritance and how that is extremely important. Now, at a theoretical level, I agree with the argument that Xi Jinping is making that you can't necessarily import whole scale values and behaviors from another society and implant them in another society and expect them to organically take root. It's going to be extremely difficult. It will create a lot of friction. So therefore, you need to find certain organic areas in which, organic roots for some of those positive values. But that doesn't mean a rejection of those positive values. So, for example, if we believe that representative democracy is a better form of governance than authoritarianism, it is useful for us to find within Indian history, Indian culture, roots for representative democracy, which makes it doesn't make it alien, and there is sufficient evidence to do that. But it is ludicrous to argue because the Communist Party wants to stay in power to say that authoritarianism is the way in which China has historically functioned. It's not necessarily that. That's not necessarily the case, right? You've not allowed democracies to function, and that's what China is saying, right? So if you're going to take the most regressive elements of your society and cultural history and say that this is what is the norm to justify your own power, that's when you undermine liberal values. And those liberal values are not necessarily Western, right? The rights of individuals, the freedom of individuals is not a Western idea. It's an idea, I mean, wherever it may have come from, at the end of the day, today, we believe that it's a progressive idea, which is where societies must move towards. So we should be making that case as opposed to necessarily the case that because it is civilizational and because culturally there are these cultural embeddings that we must therefore adhere to that. And I think that is where GCI is fundamentally
In
problematic.
terms of strategic objectives, should India take this very seriously? One, two, because India's presence in the Quad and the larger Indo-Pacific geostrategic initiatives, and they seem to be, affecting China. For example, the India, Middle Eastern, European corridor, economic corridor, the newly proposed one at New Delhi's G20 summit. All of these seem to, to indicate that India, even though it does not have documents like the GCI, GDI, etc., India does want to counter China on a larger scale. Is that the the way to counter what China is doing, or should India be doing something else in terms of officially coming out with certain things that may look like it is a better partner to, let's say, the Americans or the Europeans in terms of countering what China is doing?
Yeah, look, I mean, my thought on this is that I don't think we necessarily need to counter them at a in terms of matching initiative for initiative. Also, each of these initiatives, as anybody who goes to the document will see, are fairly nebulous. They're not the ideas that they are bringing together under one umbrella. Or the actions that they're bringing together under one umbrella are not necessarily new. They've been part of Chinese foreign policy and developmental diplomacy for some time. It's just that they're now packaged within sort of coherent frameworks, which gives us a sense of what is the vision that Beijing wants to, of the world order that it wants to create. So I don't think India necessarily needs to have initiative for initiative, competing ideas that are out there. But what I think India needs to do is firstly recognize that cumulatively all of this presents a systemic challenge to India in terms of how it shapes India's external environment, in terms of how China's security footprint will expand, in terms of the shifting nature of China's development and investment and economic footprint, So BRI was focused on hard infrastructure, roads, transport, energy, things like that. GDI is not focused on that. It's focused on the more sort of soft areas, which again expand China's not just its stake in those countries, but also its stake with civil society and with governments, and its ability to you know influence outcomes across a varied set of domains. Right. So countries in our neighborhood and in India's surrounding periphery tend to look at China essentially as a primary partner for hard infrastructure, but this will sort of shift as GDI becomes much more prominent, and China will export its governance norms through this. So again, that will have an impact on India's external environment in terms of China's presence. Thirdly, in terms of the normative shift that China is trying to bring, which is to undermine essentially the American security architecture that exists in the region. Now, I know that India has its own misgivings with that architecture, and I think those misgivings are fairly justified. The challenge is that is undermining the American security architecture at this point of time fundamentally beneficial to India given India's relationship with China? So I think we've got to sort of think of that bargain and then see whether if we endorse some of these ideas, which may seem like they correlate with us in terms of the narrative, what is the strategic effect on India? The strategic effect on India is not necessarily very good. So I think first is to assess what it does to our external environment. Second is to assess whether it's eroding our comparative advantage when it comes to our developmental and economic diplomacy. The third is to try and see what is it that we can do. And what is it that we can do, in my view, is a few things, right? Firstly, we need to make the case that this is fundamentally a regressive world order vision that Beijing is presenting, right? It's essentially presenting a vision of the world order which goes back to the sort of concert of great powers of the 1800s in some ways, and India is not a great power in that calculation. So it's essentially a hierarchical Asia in which India is not comparable to China. India needs to stand up for certain liberal ideas. India needs to stand up for make the case publicly for why democracy is good. That means investing economically in countries around us. That means not just investing economically, but also empowering civil society in countries around us. Now, to do that, of course, one of the first things that you do is look inward. And are we standing up for liberal ideas at home? Are we empowering civil society at home? Because you can't go outside and make the case of India being the mother of democracy and all those nice virtues about human rights while not respecting them back home. It just doesn't work. The world sees through. If we see through American hypocrisy every time the United States raises a finger at us, the world also sees through these arguments when we make them. I think it's therefore the framework that I present in the document is as valid for India as it is for any other democracy, which is that look, you need to remedy your challenges back home. You need to acknowledge that there are certain developmental benefits that China is bringing to these countries, which is fine, which they need. And so you don't need to reflexively push back on anything, but keep in mind the strategic effect of what is happening. You need to actively compete, right? You need to give better opportunities. And I think to some degree, India has done well in this competition vertical, right? If you look at the G20, like you talked about, pitching the G20 as the voice of the global south and so on and so forth. I think we've done well in that, but there's more to do along with our partners. And finally, we need to empower, which is in terms of our empowerment of civil society in particular, lawmakers in countries to try and examine what's happening when these investments are coming, to try and push back on authoritarianism in their own countries. And again, in this, India can work with partners, but India can also do things on its own, because India today has far more credibility with some of the countries in our region, say in Central Asia, in West Asia, as compared to, say, the United States, which countries might look at much more suspiciously because of the history of the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So I think there's much more comparative advantage that India has, and it can do much more, but it must calibrate what it must do. It need not, in doing this, counter China initiative for initiative.
Right, but at the root of all of that is building capacity, isn't it? Because you spoke about economic. I'm talking about economic capacity. I'm talking about state capacity, military capacity, and China had been focusing on that quote unquote inward looking development for a long time, and it's only now in the last decade and a half or so that it's focusing so much on on the external environment, given that it has now the confidence that its state capacity, its economic, its military capacity is built to such an extent that it can challenge the American behemoth, which India at this point of time cannot, because because of the sheer again, to use a very uncouth word, so to speak, the backwardness of its capacity. So in that sense, we still have a long way to go. But at the same time, we should also be acutely aware that China is our neighbor, and it is militarily not a very safe environment to be in which case we have a dual challenge, which is inward looking growth, but at the same time looking at China's aggressive stance in Arunachal Pradesh or Ladakh or elsewhere, that prevents us from looking developing this inward thing to such an extent that we can only relax for the next 20 years and then only look outwards. So just wanted to make a small point there that yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that capacity is an issue, and therefore, what we must do is that. That's why my objective is that that's why my recommendation is that don't necessarily go on head first challenging initiatives, unless of course those initiatives are fundamentally undermining your core interests. For example, Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC, it fundamentally undermines India's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and therefore India had a strong position on that. But when it comes to these other areas, it's reflexively challenging everything. Firstly, will not be successful in other countries, and you may not have the capacity to provide the alternative. So therefore, it's much more important to adopt what is a blunting strategy, right? So when if China is going in with big investments, if it's going in with models of governance which undermine privacy, it's important for you to do things and promote and advocate for stronger privacy safeguards in other countries. To do that, you need to have your own privacy safeguards which are robust. That your legislation must prioritize some of these things. So you need to nurture those values at home, and then you need to make a case for them internationally. If China is making secretive deals, which involve tremendous deal of corruption with, say, a particular regime in a particular country, it's important that you nurture this sense in third countries about parliamentary oversight. But again, to make that case, you need to do that at home. You need to empower those systems at home so that when you go out and make that case that this is a better model, it is much more effective. And in doing that, you will not only back for certain values which are progressive and good, such as transparency, but you will also blunt what may be Chinese initiatives which adversely affect your own strategic environment. So that liberal aspect of democracy is good as much as it is at home, as it is to make the case abroad, right? So that's my argument. I'm not saying go and challenge, because you might not be able to challenge, right? There are many issues, capacity, and also the overall effect of something that may be positive for certain countries. But you can blunt the most adverse consequences of what Beijing is doing.
Right. I want to, we're kind of running out of time. I want to end with a question that has been deeply, I'm deeply interested in whether this is, as far as Xi is personally concerned, this is his attempt to stamp his legacy in contemporary history, perhaps even for perpetuity. But do you think it's even realistic, given that the challenges of the global order, are not something that China can overcome, within a few years? Clearly, this requires, a long-term vision, a long-term, effort. In which case, it may, she may have initiated it, but it may or may not even happen. What are the geopolitical challenges that he will face in the short to middle term that will prevent him from achieving what he wants to achieve with these initiatives?
Yeah, look, I think the primary geopolitical challenge that he faces is the fact that, and I think you alluded to this earlier in this conversation, that it's not necessary that countries trust Beijing implicitly as Beijing might want to believe, right? So there is a lot of misgiving, and which is why you've seen this counterbalancing efforts such as the Quad and others come into play. So one of the things is that I think the world countries in the world, around the world, don't want to get caught up in some sort of a Cold War-esque rivalry between Beijing and Washington D.C. And as much as Chinese narrative is through all these initiatives is one of decrying the Cold War, if you look at the implicit objectives and the implicit arguments being made in all of these, it's essentially very Cold War-esque in some ways. So therefore, you will see countries treading very carefully. They will do cost-benefit analysis, and they will pick and choose where they want to and where they can engage, which is in their benefit. And I think that's the Nepal case that you cited. I think that's where the example is that that countries will have that degree of autonomy because there is this great power competition going on to try and pick and choose. Secondly, there are certain transnational issues in which countries need to work together, climate change being one of them. So as much as there may be contestation, there may be all this friction, at the end of the day, both sides in DC and Beijing recognize that there has to be some sort of mechanism where you work together. Also, in terms of the military capacity of both countries and nuclear weapons and so on and so forth, both realize that a conflict is in neither's strategic interest. So we need to find ways to work together despite this deep misgiving and deep trust. In terms of whether Xi Jinping can create, and whether China can create this sort of normative shift in the world, I think in some ways they have been fairly successful. The fact that today the arguments that they are making find resonance in countries like India, find resonance in large parts of the developing world, is an indicator of disaffection with what was seen as Western dominance of the global order. And I think Beijing has done very well to use that, to leverage that. In doing that, it has changed certain norms on human rights. I think there is a subtle shift that has taken place over the last decade. And 5-6 years in particular. Right? In 2017, China had its first South-South declaration on human rights. So there is this normative shift taking place, which I think it has been successful in engendering. Whether that necessarily means regime stability and all that will depend on a number of factors. Right? It will depend on the Chinese economy, whether the economy can continue to deliver the kind of goods that Beijing needs to be able to continue to invest in capabilities. While we say that China and the US are strategic competitors, great powers and all of that, I think it's also important to highlight that there is a huge difference in terms of per capita GDP between China and the United States. China's per capita GDP is around $12,000-$13,000. The US is far above $50,000-$60,000. So there's a huge difference that exists in terms of, like you said, potential to attract talent, natural resource capacity, so on and so forth. So there's a huge distinction that exists, and there's still a big gap. So there's a lot for Beijing to do to be able to effectively challenge, US might. But at least in what it has been able to do so far is to use the worst mistakes that America has made over the last 20-25 years, and use the disaffection of the developing world to try and undercut whatever ideas of liberalism that challenge the Communist Party's right to rule, and at least start shaping global normative governance in directions which support the Communist Party, which give much more legitimacy to the Communist Party in Beijing. So I think at this point of time, this is where this game is being played. As things progress, of course, we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you so much, Manoj, for that insightful and enlightening discussion. Really appreciate that. Thank you once again.
Thanks so much, Sachin.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.